A millionaire gave his daughter a cruel choice: marry an 80-year-old man or lose her entire fortune. She swore she would never accept such a prison, but little by little she realized that the marriage hid secrets she had never imagined. With no way out, she tried to sabotage the wedding, and what happens next will change her life forever. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Isabella Morgan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse apartment, absently swirling a glass of champagne while gazing at the glittering Manhattan skyline. The reflection that stared back at her from the glass showed a strikingly beautiful young woman dressed in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Yet her green eyes held a vacant expression that all the luxury surrounding her couldn't fill. The sound of expensive heels clicking against marble flooring announced the arrival of her personal assistant, Marie. "Miss Morgan, your father requests your presence at the Morgan Tower tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. He says it's regarding an important matter that cannot be postponed." Isabella didn't turn around, continuing to stare at the city lights below. "Tell him I'm busy. I have a spa appointment tomorrow morning and then lunch with the girls at Le Bernardin." "He was quite insistent, Miss Morgan. He mentioned it has something to do with your upcoming 25th birthday celebration." This caught Isabella's attention. Her birthday parties were legendary events in New York's high society, and she had been planning this year's celebration for months. It would be held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which her father's substantial donation had secured for a private evening event. The guest list included celebrities, socialites, and the cream of Manhattan's elite. "Fine," she sighed, finally turning to face Marie. "Cancel my morning appointments, but make sure my afternoon schedule remains unchanged. Whatever Daddy wants to discuss, it can't be that important." How wrong she was. The next morning, Isabella walked through the massive lobby of Morgan Tower, the 50-story testament to her father's real estate empire. Everyone knew her here, the princess of the Morgan dynasty. Security guards nodded respectfully. Employees hurried to hold doors open, and her father's executive assistant was already waiting by the private elevator. "Good morning, Miss Morgan. Mr. Morgan is waiting for you in the boardroom." The boardroom, that was unusual. Their family meetings typically took place in her father's office. As the elevator climbed to the top floor, Isabella checked her reflection in the mirrored walls, adjusting her Chanel jacket and running a hand through her perfectly styled honey blonde hair. When the doors opened, she was surprised to see not just her father, but also Mr. Theodore Westminster, one of their family's oldest friends and business associates. The elderly man stood as she entered, offering a polite bow of his head. "Isabella, darling," her father's voice carried its usual authoritative tone, "please have a seat. We have something very important to discuss." She sat down, crossing her legs elegantly, still not sensing the weight of what was about to come. Her father, Richard Morgan, stood at the head of the table, his steel-gray hair and tailored suit projecting the image of power he had cultivated over decades. "As you know, your 25th birthday approaches," he began, his expression unreadable. "It's time for you to take on more responsibility, to secure your future and the future of this family's legacy." Isabella brightened. Finally, she thought, her father was going to give her a real position in the company, something beyond her current ceremonial title of creative director that essentially meant attending parties and being photographed at charity events. "That's why," her father continued, "I've arranged for you to be married." The words hit her like a physical blow. She blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your marriage," Richard Morgan repeated firmly, "to Theodore." Isabella's gaze snapped to Mr. Westminster, who sat quietly observing her reaction. Theodore Westminster, the octogenarian, businessman who had been attending their family events since before she was born. Theodore Westminster, who was probably older than her grandfather would have been. A laugh bubbled up from her throat, slightly hysterical. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of bizarre birthday prank?" "This is no joke, Isabella." Her father's voice carried the same tone he used when closing million-dollar deals. "The arrangements have already been made. The announcement will be made at your birthday celebration." The room seemed to spin around her. She gripped the arms of her chair, her manicured nails digging into the leather. "You can't be serious. You can't possibly expect me to marry someone who's—" She struggled to find words that wouldn't be overtly offensive. "Who's old enough to be my grandfather." "Age is merely a number." Theodore spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but firm. "What matters is the stability and security this union will bring." Isabella stood up so abruptly, her chair rolled backward. "This is insane. I won't do it. You can't force me to marry anyone." Her father's expression hardened. "Actually, I can. Your trust fund, your apartment, your entire lifestyle. Everything is dependent on my approval. If you refuse this marriage, you'll find yourself cut off completely. No more credit cards, no more shopping sprees, no more luxury cars. Nothing." The threat hung in the air like a sword over her head. Isabella looked between the two men, waiting for someone to break character, to tell her this was all an elaborate setup. But their expressions remained unchanged, and the reality of her situation began to sink in. The next few weeks passed in a blur of denial and desperate attempts to change her father's mind. Isabella tried every tactic she could think of: tears, tantrums, pleading, reasoning, but Richard Morgan remained unmoved. The more she fought against the arrangement, the more determined he seemed to become. Her social circle buzzed with speculation about her sudden engagement to Theodore Westminster. Some praised it as a brilliant strategic alliance, while others whispered behind their hands about the scandalous age difference. Isabella withdrew from her usual social activities, unable to bear the pitying looks and barely concealed judgment. One evening, she sat alone in her favorite restaurant, Le Cirque, nursing a glass of wine and picking at an untouched plate of food. The maitre d' approached her table with his characteristic discretion. "Miss Morgan, there's a gentleman at the bar who asked me to deliver this note to you." She took the folded paper, expecting another society gossip, trying to get the inside scoop on her controversial engagement. Instead, she found a message that made her pause. "I see the sadness behind your smile. If you want to talk, I'm here to listen. No judgment, no agenda." Looking toward the bar, she saw a young man about her age, dressed in simple but well-fitted clothes that marked him as someone who wasn't part of her usual wealthy circle. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, but made no move to approach her. Against her better judgment, Isabella found herself gathering her things and moving to the bar. "I don't usually accept notes from strangers," she said, sliding onto the stool next to him. He smiled, and something about the warmth in his expression made her guard drop slightly. "I'm Alex Chen," he replied. "I work as a financial analyst. So downtown. Now we're not strangers anymore." "And what makes you think I need someone to talk to, Alex Chen?" "Because I've been watching you sit alone for the past hour, staring at your wineglass like it holds the secrets of the universe." He shrugged. "Plus, I read the society pages. The engagement announcement caused quite a stir." Isabella tensed, preparing for the usual mixture of curiosity and judgment. But Alex's next words surprised her. "You know, my grandmother was forced into an arranged marriage back in China," he said conversationally. "She always told me that the hardest prison to escape is the one built with golden bars." The metaphor hit too close to home, and Isabella felt tears threatening to spill. She blinked them back furiously. "What would you know about it? About having your entire life controlled by someone else's expectations?" "More than you might think," Alex replied quietly. "My parents sacrificed everything to send me to America for education. They had my whole life planned out. Prestigious university, high-paying job, marriage to a nice Chinese girl from a good family. But sometimes the life others plan for us isn't the life we're meant to live." For the first time in weeks, Isabella felt someone actually understood her situation. Not the surface-level drama of a young woman being married to a much older man, but the deeper struggle of fighting against the weight of family expectations and obligations. "So what did you do?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I compromised," Alex said, finishing his drink. "I got the education, took the job, but I'm living life on my own terms. Sometimes small acts of rebellion are more powerful than grand gestures." His words sparked something in Isabella's mind. She had been fighting her father head-on, trying to break free through direct confrontation. But maybe there was another way. The next morning, she surprised everyone by announcing that she would agree to the engagement with conditions. She insisted on a long engagement period with plenty of public appearances together. Her father was suspicious of her sudden compliance, but agreed, seeing it as a sign that she was finally accepting her responsibilities. What he didn't know was that Isabella had a plan. If direct defiance wouldn't work, she would make this engagement so socially uncomfortable that Theodore himself would want to back out. She would turn every public appearance into a spectacle, every society event into an opportunity to create whispers and raised eyebrows. Her first move came at the official engagement announcement party. Instead of the demure, appropriate dress her father's staff had selected, she arrived in a dress that would have been more appropriate for a woman half her age, drawing shocked gasps from the conservative crowd. She spent the evening flirting, outrageously with young men, making sure photographers captured every moment. Theodore's reaction, however, wasn't what she expected. Instead of anger or embarrassment, he seemed almost amused by her antics. When she deliberately spilled champagne on his expensive suit, he simply dabbed at it with a napkin and asked if she'd like to hear about the time he had to navigate a business meeting with an entire cup of coffee down his shirt. One rainy afternoon, Isabella found herself alone with Theodore in his vast library. She had arrived for one of their scheduled getting-to-know-each-other meetings, determined to make it as unbearable as possible. However, something about the peaceful atmosphere of the book-lined room made her usual sharp tongue feel out of place. Theodore sat in a leather armchair, his posture relaxed as he poured tea from an antique silver service. "Would you like to hear a story, Isabella?" he asked, offering her a delicate porcelain cup. She accepted the cup automatically, prepared to be bored by some tedious business anecdote. "Let me guess. Another tale about how you built your fortune." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Actually, it's about how I lost my first one." This caught her attention. "You lost a fortune?" "Oh yes," he nodded, settling back in his chair. "I was about your age, perhaps a bit younger. I had inherited my father's shipping company and thought I knew everything there was to know about business. I was arrogant, impulsive, and completely blind to my own limitations." Isabella found herself leaning forward slightly, her tea forgotten. "What happened? I made a series of risky investments, ignored the advice of more experienced advisors, and within 2 years I had lost everything." His voice carried no bitterness, only a thoughtful reflection. "I had to start over completely, working as a clerk in a competitor's office. But how did you recover? How did you build all of this?" She gestured to the opulent surroundings. Theodore's eyes twinkled. "By learning the most valuable lesson of my life, that true wealth isn't about money at all. It's about understanding what really matters to you, what you're willing to fight for, and what you're willing to lose." The words hit Isabella with unexpected force. She thought about her own situation, about all the things she was afraid to lose, her lifestyle, her status, her comfort. But what was she willing to fight for? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, studying his face carefully. "Because, my dear, I see in you the same fire I once had, the same determination to prove something to the world." He paused, taking a sip of his tea. "But perhaps you're fighting the wrong battle." Before Isabella could respond, the library door opened and her father strode in, his presence immediately filling the room with tension. "I trust you're having a productive afternoon?" he asked, his tone carrying a warning edge. "Very productive," Theodore answered smoothly. "Your daughter has quite an interesting perspective on international markets." Isabella blinked, realizing they hadn't discussed business at all. Why was Theodore covering for her? She had spent the last few weeks trying to sabotage this arrangement, yet here he was, apparently trying to make her look good in front of her father. Later that evening, she found herself at the small cafe where she had first met Alex. He was there again, as she had hoped he would be, sitting at a corner table with a laptop and a stack of papers. Rough day? He asked as she slid into the chair across from him. Confusing day, she corrected, then proceeded to tell him about her afternoon with Theodore. I don't understand him. He should be angry with me or at least frustrated. Instead, he tells me stories about losing his fortune and starting over. Alex closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. Maybe he sees something in you that you don't see in yourself. What's that supposed to mean? Think about it. You've been trying to show everyone how wrong this marriage would be. But what if the real question isn't about the marriage at all? What if it's about who you want to be, regardless of who you marry or don't marry? Isabella started to protest, then stopped. She thought about Theodore's words about fighting the wrong battle, about understanding what really matters. For the first time, she considered that maybe her rebellion wasn't just about avoiding marriage to an older man. It was about finding her own path, her own identity, beyond being Richard Morgan's daughter. The realization must have shown on her face because Alex smiled knowingly. You know, there's a gallery opening tomorrow night. Nothing fancy like what you're used to. Just local artists in a converted warehouse. Want to see how the other half lives? The old Isabella would have dismissed the invitation immediately. But something had shifted inside her. What time? As she left the cafe, she didn't notice the black town car parked across the street, or the man inside taking photographs of her conversation with Alex. She didn't know that by the next morning, those photos would be on her father's desk, setting in motion events that would change everything. The gallery opening was nothing like the polished, champagne-flowing events Isabella was accustomed to attending. The converted warehouse space was raw and industrial, with exposed brick walls and visible ductwork. Instead of designer gowns and tuxedos, the crowd wore an eclectic mix of vintage clothing and artistic ensembles. She felt simultaneously overdressed, in her simple black dress and Louboutin heels, yet strangely liberated. Alex met her at the entrance, dressed casually in dark jeans and a well-worn leather jacket. Ready to experience art without the price tags? He asked, offering her a plastic cup of wine that definitely wasn't the vintage she usually drank. As they walked through the gallery, Isabella found herself drawn into conversations that had nothing to do with social status or business connections. Artists explained their work with passionate intensity, speaking about inspiration and meaning rather than investment potential. She met photographers who worked second jobs to fund their projects, painters who shared tiny apartments to afford studio space, and sculptors who scavenged materials from construction sites. What do you think? Alex asked as they paused in front of a large abstract canvas. Isabella studied the bold strokes and vibrant colors. It's alive, she said finally. Not perfect or polished, but somehow more real because of that. She realized she could have been describing the entire evening. Speaking of real, Alex gestured to a small cafe area set up in the corner of the warehouse. Want to try the best tamales in New York? Made by Maria over there. She's also the artist behind those incredible photographs of immigrant families. The evening continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Isabella found herself sitting on a folding chair, eating street food with plastic utensils and having the most genuine conversations she'd had in years. These people didn't care about her last name or her bank account. They cared about ideas, passions, and dreams. I can't remember the last time I felt this normal, she confessed to Alex as they walked along the riverside afterward. The night air was cool and she had borrowed his jacket, the leather soft and worn against her skin. Normal is underrated, he replied with a smile. You know what I see when I look at you, Isabella. Not the socialite heiress or the rebellious daughter, but someone trying to break free from a script they didn't write. She stopped walking, turning to face him. But how? How do you just walk? Away from everything you've ever known? Maybe you don't have to walk away. Maybe you just have to start writing your own pages in that script. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture both casual and intimate. The moment was interrupted by the harsh ring of her phone. Isabella pulled it out, seeing her father's name on the screen. She declined the call, but the spell was broken. I should go, she said reluctantly, slipping off Alex's jacket and handing it back. Keep it, he said. It looks better on you anyway. The next morning, Isabella walked into her father's office, carrying a coffee and wearing sunglasses to hide her lack of sleep. She expected the usual lecture about responsibility and family obligations. Instead, she found both her father and Theodore waiting for her, along with a thick folder on the desk between them. "Sit down, Isabella." Her father's voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. "We need to discuss your recent activities." He opened the folder, spreading out photographs across his desk. There she was, entering the gallery with Alex, sitting close to him at the cafe, walking along the riverside wearing his jacket. Each image looked innocent enough on its own, but arranged. Together, they told a story of secrecy and rebellion. "Do you have any idea who this young man is?" her father demanded. "Did you bother to do any background check before gallivanting around the city with him?" "His name is Alex Chen," Isabella began, but Theodore cut her off gently. "Alex Chen," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected note of concern, "or Alexander Chen Martinez, to use his full name, has quite an interesting history of getting close to wealthy young women during their moments of vulnerability." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" Her father pushed another document across the desk, a police report from 3 years ago. "He's been involved in several cases of fraud and identity theft, although nothing was ever proven. He's quite skilled at gaining trust and accessing sensitive information." The room seemed to spin around her. Isabella thought about all their conversations, how he always seemed to know exactly what to say, how he'd encouraged her to rebel against her family's expectations. Had it all been calculated? Was she just another mark in his con game? "I understand. You're hurt," Theodore said softly. "But this is exactly why your father and I have been trying to protect you. The world isn't always what it seems, especially for someone in your position." Isabella stood up abruptly, unable to bear their concerned expressions. She rushed out of the office, ignoring her father's calls to come back. In the elevator, she pulled out her phone and typed a message to Alex. "Who are you really?" The response came almost immediately. "Someone who cares about you. Let me explain." But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Isabella wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Isabella sat in her penthouse apartment, staring at her phone where Alex's messages continued to pile up. Each one begged for a chance to explain. Each one promised there was more to the story than what her father had shown her. But how could she trust anything he said now? The sun had set hours ago, and the city lights created dancing shadows across her living room. A half-empty glass of wine sat untouched on the coffee table. She had cancelled all her appointments for the day, unable to face the world while her mind spun with questions and doubts. The soft ding of the elevator announced an unexpected visitor. Isabella turned to see Theodore stepping into her apartment, carrying a familiar-looking file folder. "Your doorman called to check if you were okay," he explained, settling into an armchair across from her. "You haven't left the apartment in 3 days." "I'm fine," she replied automatically, then laughed bitterly. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I'm an idiot who fell for exactly the kind of manipulation my father always warned me about. You must be thrilled to see how right you both were." Theodore was quiet for a moment, studying her with those keen eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. "Actually," he said finally, "I came to show you something that your father didn't want you to see." He opened the folder and pulled out a different set of photographs. These showed Alex in various business settings, sitting in corporate meetings, giving presentations, shaking hands with executives. "Alexander Chen Martinez is indeed not who he claimed to be," Theodore continued, "but not in the way you think. He's actually a rising star at Clayton & Brooks Investment Banking. The fraud allegations your father showed you were from a case that was not only dismissed, but proven to be false accusations from a competitor trying to damage his reputation." Isabella's hand trembled as she picked up one of the photos. "But why would my father lie about this?" "Because Alexander Chen Martinez represents everything Richard Morgan fears most: change, independence, and a new generation of business leaders who don't play by the old rules." Theodore leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Your father's world is changing, Isabella. The old ways of doing business, of controlling every aspect of one's legacy, They're becoming obsolete. Is that why you agreed to this arranged marriage? She asked suddenly. To help my father maintain control? A smile played at the corners of Theodore's mouth. I agreed to this arrangement because I saw an opportunity to help someone learn the same lessons it took me decades to understand. Sometimes the cage we think protects us is actually what's holding us back from flying. Isabella stood up and walked to the window, her mind racing. If Alex isn't a con man, then why didn't he tell me who he really was? Why pretend to be just a financial analyst? Perhaps, Theodore suggested, he wanted you to see him as a person first, not a position or a portfolio, something you yourself might understand. The truth of those words hit her hard. Hadn't she always longed for people to see beyond her family name and trust fund, to be valued for who she was, rather than what she represented? Her phone buzzed again with another message from Alex. I know I should have been honest from the start. No more pretenses. Meet me at the cafe where we first met. I'll tell you everything. Go, Theodore said, apparently having read the message over her shoulder. But remember, the truth you find might not be the one you're expecting. Isabella grabbed her coat and headed for the elevator, then paused. Why are you helping me? Like this, you could have just let me continue believing my father's version. Theodore stood, straightening his jacket with a dignified movement. Because, my dear, sometimes the best way to help someone find their path is to simply illuminate the crossroads. The choice of which direction to take must always be their own. The ride to the cafe seemed to take forever. Isabella's mind raced with questions and possibilities. She had felt so certain about everything just a few days ago. Her rebellion against the arranged marriage, her growing feelings for Alex, her determination to break free from her father's control. Now all those certainties had crumbled, replaced by a confusing mix of doubt and hope. As she stepped out of her car, she saw Alex waiting outside the cafe. He was dressed differently now, in a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of the success Theodore had described. Yet his expression held the same warmth and sincerity she had grown to trust. I think, she said, approaching him slowly, we need to start this conversation over, from the beginning, with the truth this time. Alex nodded, his relief visible. The complete truth, he agreed, about who I am, about your father's company, and about why this arranged marriage might not be what you think it is. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean about my father's company? Let's go inside, Alex said quietly. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about your father's empire. Inside the cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner booth, Alex pulled out his tablet and began pulling up documents. Isabella watched as spreadsheets, financial reports, and news articles filled the screen. I've been tracking the Morgan Real Estate Group for the past year as part of my work at Clayton & Brooks, Alex explained, his voice low and serious. What we've discovered is a pattern of increasingly risky investments and leveraged positions that would shock most of your father's investors if they knew. Isabella leaned closer, trying to make sense of the numbers scrolling past. What are you saying? Your father's empire is built on sand, Alex said gently. The company has been using complex financial instruments to hide mounting debts and losses. The latest projections suggest it's only a matter of months before the truth becomes impossible to conceal. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Isabella gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. That's impossible. My father, he always knows what he's doing. He's brilliant at business. He was, Alex agreed, but the market has changed. New regulations, shifting investor preferences, the rise of sustainable development. Your father's old-school approach hasn't adapted. Instead of changing his methods, he's been trying to maintain the appearance of success through increasingly desperate measures. And Theodore, where does he fit into all this? Alex's expression grew even more serious. Theodore Westminster isn't just wealthy, he's liquid. His companies are stable, diversified, and most importantly, they have the kind of clean reputation that could save your father's business if they were to merge. The pieces started falling into place in Isabella's mind. The marriage. It's not about me at all, is it? It's about securing Theodore's help to save the company. Yes and no, Alex replied, closing down the documents. I believe Theodore knows exactly what your father is trying to do, but I don't think that's why he agreed to the arrangement." Isabella thought back to her conversations with Theodore, his cryptic comments about learning life's important lessons. "He's been trying to teach me something all along," she realized. "About value, about truth, about making my own choices." "The question is," Alex said softly, "what are you going to do with this information?" Before Isabella could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Come to the office immediately. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Need to discuss your role." She showed the message to Alex, who nodded grimly. "The board must be starting to ask questions. Your father's probably trying to shore up support before things get worse." "I should go," Isabella said, standing up. Then she paused, looking at Alex with new understanding. "Thank you for telling me the truth, even though it wasn't easy." "Isabella," he called as she turned to leave, "whatever you decide to do, remember, sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting against something, but fighting for something." The ride to her father's office gave her time to think. All her life, she had been fighting against her father's control, against societal expectations, against the gilded cage of privilege. But what was she fighting for? What did she truly want her life to mean? As the elevator climbed to the top floor of Morgan Tower, Isabella straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. For the first time, she wasn't walking into her father's office as a rebellious daughter or a pawn in his games. She was walking in as someone who finally understood the true stakes of the game. The sight that greeted her when the elevator doors opened, however, was not what she expected. Her father stood in the lobby, his face ashen, with Theodore beside him looking more concerned than she had ever seen him, and clutched in her father's trembling hands was a newspaper that would change everything. The newspaper headline screamed, in bold letters, "Morgan Real Estate Empire on the Brink. Sources reveal massive financial irregularities." Isabella felt her stomach drop as she scanned the article. Everything Alex had told her was there in black and white, splashed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal. "It's all falling apart," her father said, his voice barely above a whisper. The usual commanding presence that defined Richard Morgan had crumbled, replaced by a man who suddenly looked every one of his 65 years. Someone leaked confidential documents to the press. "By morning, our stock will be in freefall." Theodore guided them both into the private conference room, closing the door on the curious eyes of the office staff. "Richard, perhaps it's time to tell Isabella everything." Her father sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. "What's there to tell? She can read it all in the papers now. 25 years of building this company, my father's legacy, everything we worked for, gone." "Not everything," Theodore said firmly, "but the truth needs to come out, all of it." Isabella remained standing, her mind racing to process everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked her father. "All these years I thought this was about controlling my life, about maintaining your power. But you were desperate, weren't you?" Richard Morgan looked up at his daughter, and for the first time in her life, she saw tears in his eyes. "I wanted to protect you, to ensure you would be taken care of when everything fell apart. Theodore, he was my safety net for you." "The marriage arrangement," Isabella said slowly, understanding dawning. "It wasn't just about saving the company. You were trying to secure my future before everything collapsed." "Your father came to me 6 months ago," Theodore explained gently. "He knew the company was in trouble, knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. He asked for my help, not just financially, but to guide you through what was coming." Isabella turned to Theodore, realization striking her. "That's why you never got angry at my rebellion. You were waiting for me to figure it out on my own." "You needed to understand your own strength," Theodore nodded, "to see that you're capable of standing on your own feet, with or without your father's fortune." A knock at the door interrupted them. Richard's executive assistant entered, her face pale. "Mr. Morgan, the board members are calling. They're demanding an emergency meeting tonight instead of waiting until morning. And there are reporters gathering in the lobby." Isabella watched her father seem to age another decade in those few seconds. This man who had always been a tower of strength, who had controlled every aspect of their lives with unwavering authority, now looked lost and broken. Something shifted inside her. All her life, she had seen her father as an obstacle to overcome, a force to rebel against. Now she saw him as what he truly was, a human being who had tried, in his own flawed way, to protect the people he loved. "What are you going to tell the board?" she asked. "The truth," he replied wearily. "What else can I do? By morning everything will be gone, the company, our reputation, your future." "No," Isabella said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Not everything." She turned to Theodore. "You once told me that true wealth isn't about money, that it's about understanding what really matters to you, what you're willing to fight for." Theodore's eyes sparkled with something that looked like pride. "And what are you willing to fight for, Isabella?" She straightened her shoulders, feeling a clarity she had never experienced before. Family, truth, the chance to build something. Real something honest. She looked at her father. "The company might be in trouble, but we're still here, and maybe this is our chance to start over, to do things differently." Her father looked up at her, confusion mixing with a hint of hope. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that instead of hiding from this crisis, we face it head-on, together." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. "And I think I know someone who can help us navigate through it." As she pressed the call button, both men watched her with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. When Alex's voice answered, Isabella took a deep breath. "I need your help," she said. "Not as Alexander Chen Martinez of Clayton and Brooks, but as someone who understands both the old world and the new. Will you help us find a way forward?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Finally, Alex's voice came through the speaker, clear and determined. "I'm on my way." While they waited for Alex to arrive, Isabella took charge, in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. She instructed her father's assistant to hold off the board members for 1 hour, promising a full presentation that would address all their concerns. She asked Theodore to contact his lawyers, and she began drafting a statement for the press. "What are you doing?" her father asked, watching her work with a mixture of confusion and admiration. "Something I should have done a long time ago," she replied, not looking up from her laptop. "Taking responsibility, not just for myself but for our family's legacy." When Alex arrived 30 minutes later, he brought with him a team of financial analysts and legal experts from Clayton and Brooks. The conference room quickly transformed into a war room, with documents spread across tables and strategies being debated in urgent whispers. "The situation is serious," Alex explained, pointing to various financial projections, "but not unsalvageable. The key is transparency and a clear path forward." Isabella watched as he laid out a plan that was both bold and pragmatic. The Morgan Real Estate Group would need to undergo a complete restructuring. Some assets would need to be sold, some projects abandoned. The company would emerge smaller but stronger, with a new focus on sustainable development and ethical investment practices. "It's not just about saving the company," Alex continued, his eyes meeting Isabella's. "It's about transforming it into something that can thrive in today's world." Theodore, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "I'm willing to help, but not through a marriage arrangement." He smiled at Isabella. "I think we can all agree that was never the right solution." Richard Morgan looked between Alex and his daughter, seeing something he had missed before. You planned this together?" "No," Isabella said firmly. "Alex showed me the truth, but this plan..." She gestured to the documents spread before them. "This is about all of us choosing to do the right thing, together." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Legal documents were drafted, press statements were refined, and a comprehensive presentation for the board was prepared. Throughout it all, Isabella found herself working seamlessly with Alex, their different perspectives and experiences combining to create solutions neither could have developed alone. As the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they finally had a solid plan to present to the board. The company would undergo a voluntary restructuring, with Theodore Westminster's firm acting as a strategic partner rather than a savior. Alex's team from Clayton and Brooks would oversee the financial restructuring, ensuring transparency and compliance with all regulations. But the most surprising element of the plan came from Isabella herself. "I want to be part of this," she announced to the room. "Not as the owner's daughter, but as someone who has to earn her place. I want to learn the business from the ground up, understand every aspect of what we do and how we can do it better." Her father, who had been quietly watching her take charge throughout the night, finally found his voice. "You would do that, even after everything?" Isabella looked around the room, at Theodore's proud smile, at Alex's encouraging nod, at the team of professionals who had worked through the night to help save her family's legacy. "I'm not doing it for you," she said softly. "I'm doing it for us, for the future we can build together." The moment was interrupted by Richard's assistant rushing in. "The board members are here. They're demanding to start the meeting now." Isabella stood, straightening her jacket. The scared, rebellious girl who had run from responsibility was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Let's go," she said, gathering the presentation materials. "It's time to show them who we really are." As they walked toward the boardroom, Alex caught her hand. "Are you ready for this?" She squeezed his hand once before letting go. "For the first time in my life," she replied, "I truly am." The boardroom of Morgan Tower had witnessed countless pivotal moments in the company's history, but none quite like this. Isabella stood before the assembled board members, her presentation materials ready, feeling the weight of generations of business legacy on her shoulders. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where 12 stern faces watched her with varying degrees of skepticism and concern. These were people who had known her since childhood, who had attended her extravagant birthday parties, and watched her grow up in the lap of luxury. Now they would have to see her in a completely different light. "Ladies and gentlemen of the EEE board," Isabella began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I know you've all seen this morning's headlines. You're here because you want answers and you deserve them. But more than answers, you deserve a solution." For the next hour, Isabella led the presentation with a confidence that surprised even herself. She outlined the company's current situation with unflinching honesty, acknowledged the mistakes that had been made, and then presented their comprehensive plan for restructuring and renewal. "The Morgan Real Estate Group has always been about building," she said, approaching the conclusion. "My grandfather built this company from nothing. My father built it into an empire. Now it's time for us to build something new, something sustainable, transparent, and aligned with the values of today's world." One of the board members, Janet Chen, who had always been particularly critical of Isabella's lifestyle, spoke up. "This all sounds very noble, Miss Morgan, but what makes you think you're qualified to be part of this transformation? Your expertise seems limited to spending the company's money, not making it." The old Isabella might have responded with anger or stormed out of the room. Instead, she smiled. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Chen. I don't have the expertise, yet. That's why I'm proposing to start at the bottom. I want to learn every aspect of this business, from property management to development planning. I'm not asking for a position I haven't earned." Another board member leaned forward. "And Mr. Westminster, we were led to believe there would be a merger through marriage. Now you're proposing a different kind of partnership." Theodore stood up smoothly. "The merger was never the right solution. What this company needs isn't a rescue. It's a renaissance. My firm is prepared to partner with Morgan Real Estate Group in a way that preserves its independence while providing the stability needed for transformation." Alex then took the floor, presenting detailed financial projections and restructuring plans. The board members peppered him with questions, but he handled each one with expertise and clarity. Isabella watched him with a mixture of pride and gratitude, seeing how his understanding of both old and new business paradigms was exactly what they needed. As the presentation concluded, the board called for a private deliberation. Isabella, her father, Theodore, and Alex waited in the adjacent conference room. The tension was palpable. "Whatever happens," Richard said quietly to his daughter, "I want you to know how proud I am of you today. You showed true leadership in there." Isabella felt tears threatening but held them back. I learned from watching you, Dad. Not the mistakes, but the strength, the determination to keep fighting no matter what. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, they were called back into the boardroom. The chairman of the board, William Preston, stood to deliver their decision. The board has voted, he announced, his expression unreadable. While we are deeply concerned about the events that led us here, we are cautiously optimistic about the plan presented today. However, we have some conditions. Isabella held her breath as Preston continued. First, we want quarterly audits by an independent firm. Second, the restructuring must begin immediately. Third, he looked directly at Isabella, if you're serious about learning the business from the ground up, we want to see a detailed development plan for your education and integration into the company. No shortcuts, no special treatment. A smile spread across Isabella's face. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mr. Preston. As the board members filed out, Janet Chen paused beside Isabella. I hope you prove me wrong about you, Miss Morgan. This company could use some fresh perspective. The morning's first crisis had been averted, but Isabella knew this was just the beginning. As she gathered her materials, she felt Alex's presence beside her. Ready for the next challenge? He asked softly. The press is still waiting downstairs. Isabella squared her shoulders. Actually, I have an idea about that. Something that might surprise everyone. Instead of hiding from the press or issuing a standard statement through a spokesperson, Isabella suggested something unprecedented for the Morgan family. Complete transparency. She wanted to hold a press conference, not in the sterile corporate environment of Morgan Tower, but in front of one of their oldest properties, a historic building that had been their first major development. Are you sure about this? Her father asked as they prepared. The press can be brutal. That's exactly why we need to face them directly, Isabella replied, checking her appearance one last time. No more hiding, no more manipulation of the truth. It's time for a new chapter. The scene outside the historic Morgan building was chaotic. Journalists and photographers crowded the sidewalk, their cameras and microphones ready. The morning sun cast a golden glow on the building's classic architecture, a reminder of the legacy they were fighting to preserve. Isabella stepped up to the makeshift podium with her father Theodore and Alex, arranged supportively behind her. The camera flashes were blinding, but she didn't flinch. Good morning, she began, her voice clear and steady. You all know who I am. Isabella Morgan, the socialite daughter, the girl who made headlines for her extravagant parties and rebellious behavior. But today I'm here to introduce you to someone else, the woman I'm becoming. The reporters fell silent, caught off guard by her unusual opening. Yes, the Morgan Real Estate Group is facing challenges. Yes, mistakes were made. But instead of hiding from these truths, we're choosing to embrace them as opportunities for transformation. She gestured to the building behind her. This building represents where we came from. Solid foundations, classic values, a commitment to quality. But just as New York City has evolved, so must we. Questions began flying from the crowd. What about the reported financial irregularities? Is it true you were going to marry Theodore Westminster to save the company? Will there be layoffs? Isabella handled each question with a combination of honesty and diplomacy that impressed even the most cynical reporters. She outlined the broad strokes of their restructuring plan, emphasized their commitment to transparency, and announced her own intention to work her way up through the company. Miss Morgan, one reporter called out, you've been known for your privileged lifestyle. Why should anyone believe you're serious about working from the bottom up? Isabella smiled. Because starting tomorrow morning, I'm moving out of my penthouse apartment. I'm giving up my trust fund and credit cards. I'm going to live on the same salary as any other entry-level employee in our company. She could feel her father's surprised intake of breath behind her. This part hadn't been in their planned statement. And the arranged marriage? Another reporter pressed. Was that just a financial arrangement? Theodore stepped forward. If I may address that question, the proposed marriage was a mistake, one born of old-world thinking. The future of business isn't about arranged mergers. or family alliances. It's about innovation, adaptation, and authentic leadership. That's why I'm proud to partner with the Morgan Group in a professional capacity, supporting their transformation while maintaining their independence. As the press conference continued, Isabella could see the narrative shifting. The story was no longer just about a company in crisis. It was about evolution, redemption, and the courage to change. After the last question was answered, Isabella felt Alex's hand briefly touch her back as they turned to leave. "That was incredible," he whispered. "But are you really sure about giving up everything?" She looked at him, seeing the concern in his eyes. "I'm not giving up everything," she replied softly. "I'm just learning to value different things." Later. That evening, as the news coverage rolled in and social media buzzed with discussions about her dramatic announcement, Isabella sat in her penthouse one last time. She looked around at the luxury she had taken for granted all her life, the designer furniture, the art collection, the view that had defined her world for so long. Tomorrow she would move into a modest apartment in Brooklyn, start her new job in the property management division, and begin building a life on her own terms. But tonight she had one last task to complete. She opened her laptop and began to write, "Dear Theodore, I owe you an apology and a thank you." Isabella's first morning in Brooklyn felt like waking up in a different world. The sounds of the neighborhood, distant trains, children playing, street vendors calling out, were a far cry from the muffled silence of her penthouse sanctuary. Her new apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up with creaky hardwood floors and radiators that clanked in the morning. It was smaller than her former closet, but somehow it felt more real. She had brought only the essentials, some basic clothing, her laptop, and a few cherished photos. The furniture was second-hand, carefully selected from local shops. The bed wasn't Italian leather, but it was comfortable. The kitchen wasn't equipped with professional-grade appliances, but it had everything she needed to learn how to cook for herself. As she prepared for her first day of work, Isabella found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Gone were the designer labels and perfectly styled hair. Instead, she wore a simple business-casual outfit and minimal makeup. The woman looking back at her seemed younger somehow, more vulnerable, but also more authentic. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Ready for your first day? Coffee at Bailey's in 20. Bailey's was a small coffee shop around the corner from her new place, nothing like the exclusive cafes she used to frequent. When she arrived, Alex was already there, holding 2 paper cups and wearing a proud smile. "Your first proper bodega coffee," he announced, handing her one of the cups. "A true New York rite of passage." Isabella took a sip and wrinkled her nose. "It's strong." "It's real," Alex laughed. "Just like everything else you're about to experience." They walked together toward the subway station, joining the morning rush of commuters. Isabella had never taken the subway before. She had always been driven everywhere in luxury cars with tinted windows. Now she stood on the crowded platform, clutching her coffee and her Metro card, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. "The property management office is expecting you at 8, Alex reminded her. "Remember, you asked for no special treatment." "And I meant it," Isabella nodded firmly. "I need to learn everything from the ground up." The subway car was packed, and Isabella found herself squeezed between a woman reading a novel and a man in construction gear. The familiar scent of her expensive perfume mingled with the earthy, democratic atmosphere of public transportation. Somehow it felt right. When she arrived at the property management office, a decidedly unglamorous space in one of their older buildings, she was greeted by Susan Martinez, a middle-aged woman with practical shoes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Welcome to the real world, Miss Morgan," Susan said, not unkindly. "Your first task is to help process maintenance requests. We have over 50 pending items that need to be logged, prioritized, and assigned to our maintenance staff." Isabella spent the morning learning the property management software, a far cry from the sleek applications she was used to. The requests ranged from leaky faucets to broken elevators, each one representing a real problem affecting real people's lives. During her lunch break, taken at her desk with a sandwich from the deli downstairs, she received a text from Theodore. "How's the first day going?" She smiled as she typed her reply. "Learning more in one morning than I did in 25 years of privilege." The afternoon brought a new challenge. Susan asked her to accompany the maintenance supervisor on his rounds, visiting apartments with ongoing issues. In one unit, she met an elderly couple who had lived in the building for 40 years. They told her stories about how the neighborhood had changed, about how her grandfather had personally assured them their rent would always remain reasonable. "He was a good man, your grandfather," the old woman said, showing Isabella a faded photograph of a much younger Richard Morgan Sr. shaking hands with her husband. He understood that buildings aren't just property, they're people's homes. By the end of the day, Isabella's feet ached from walking up and down stairs. Her hands were smudged with ink from taking notes, and her mind was full of new information. But she felt something she had never experienced before, the satisfaction of a day's honest work. As she left the office, she noticed a familiar black town car parked across the street. Her father sat in the back seat, watching the building. When he saw her notice him, he rolled down the window and motioned for her to come over. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said awkwardly. "Your mother is worried about you in this neighborhood." Isabella looked around at the bustling street, at the mix of people heading home from work, at the small businesses closing up for the day. "I'm doing fine, Dad. Better than fine, actually. I'm learning who I am without all the trappings." Her father studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You remind me of him, you know. Your grandfather. He used to say that real success isn't about how high you climb, but about remembering to look back and help others up the ladder." "Would you—" Isabella hesitated, then continued. "Would you like to come up and see my apartment? It's not much, but I made it my own." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then, to her surprise, he opened the car door. "Lead the way," he said, straightening his expensive suit. "Show me your new world." Richard Morgan looked distinctly out of place in Isabella's modest apartment, his bespoke suit a sharp contrast to the second-hand furniture and bare walls. He stood in the middle of the small living room, taking in every detail with an unreadable expression. "It's cozy," he said finally, clearly struggling to find an appropriate word. Isabella couldn't help but smile. "That's real estate speak. For a small, Dad. I know it's not what you're used to, but it's what I need right now." She watched as her father walked to the window, looking out at the fire escape and the brick wall of the neighboring building. This was a man who had spent his life building towers that touched the sky, who measured success in square footage and profit margins. Yet there was something in his expression that suggested he was seeing more than just a humble apartment. "Your grandfather's first apartment in New York wasn't much bigger than this," he said suddenly. "Did I ever tell you that story?" Isabella shook her head, settling onto her second-hand couch. Her father remained standing, but his posture relaxed slightly. As he continued, he came to America with nothing but determination and a head full of dreams. Worked as a janitor in the buildings he would later own. Every night he would study blueprints and property laws, teaching himself the business from the ground up. He turned to face his daughter. "I guess you're more like him than I realized." "Why? Didn't you ever tell me these stories before?" Isabella asked softly. Her father sighed, finally sitting down beside her. "Because I wanted to protect you from the struggle. I thought giving you everything would make your life better. Instead, I might have prevented you from finding your own strength." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with understanding. That didn't need words. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice unusually gentle. "Theodore called me today. He wanted to discuss the partnership details, but mostly he wanted to tell me how impressed he was with you at the press conference." Isabella felt a warm glow of pride. "He's been kinder to me than I deserved, especially in the beginning when I was trying so hard to sabotage everything." "And what about Alex?" her father asked, a hint of his old protectiveness creeping into his voice. "Are you and he—" "We're friends," Isabella interrupted firmly. "Good friends. He's helping me understand the business world from a different perspective. And before you worry, no, He's not taking advantage of the situation. If anything, he's been pushing me to work harder, to prove myself on my own merits." Richard nodded. Slowly. "I had him investigated, you know, after I first saw you together at that cafe. What I found wasn't what I expected. A young man who built himself up from nothing, who earned everything he has through hard work and integrity. I could have told you that, instead of trying to paint him as a con man. I'm sorry for that." The apology hung in the air, carrying the weight of years of control and manipulation. Isabella reached out and took her father's hand. "We both have a lot to learn," she said. "About trust, about letting go, about building something new without tearing down everything that came before." A noise from the street drew their attention, children laughing, music playing from a passing car, the symphony of real life happening below. Richard Morgan stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "I should go. Your mother will be wondering where I am." He paused at the door. "But perhaps you could come to dinner this weekend. Not at the house. Somewhere simple. Your choice." Isabella smiled. "There's a great little Italian place around the corner. Nothing like the restaurants you're used to, but the food is amazing. And the owner has been in the neighborhood for 30 years. He might have some interesting perspectives on local property values and community needs." Her father's eyes twinkled with unexpected appreciation. "Always thinking about the business. I see. You really are a Morgan." "Yes," Isabella agreed, "but maybe a different kind of Morgan than we've seen before." After her father left, Isabella stood at her window, watching him get into his waiting car. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dinner tonight? The team wants to hear about your first day." She typed back, "Can't. Tonight. Need to work on the maintenance request backlog and prepare for tomorrow. Rain check?" His response came quickly. "Look at you, all responsible. I'm proud of you, Isabella Morgan." She smiled, setting the phone aside and turning to her laptop. There were tenant complaints to review, maintenance schedules to learn, and a whole new world to understand. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't just playing a role or fulfilling an obligation. She was building something of her own, brick by brick, day by day. 3 months into her new life, Isabella was beginning to find her rhythm. Her days started early, often before sunrise, as she reviewed maintenance reports and prepared for the day ahead. The property management office had become a second home, and her co-workers had gradually stopped seeing her as the boss's daughter and started treating her as just another member of the team. One morning, as she was reviewing tenant complaints about the heating system in one of their older buildings, Susan Martinez dropped a thick folder on her desk. "Time for your quarterly review," Susan announced. "And before you ask, yes, you're getting the same evaluation process as every other employee. No special treatment, remember." Isabella straightened in her chair, feeling a flutter of nervous anticipation. She had worked hard these past months, taking on every task without complaint, staying late to learn the systems, even coming in on weekends to help with emergency maintenance issues. But would it be enough? The review was thorough and unflinching. Susan praised her dedication and quick learning, but pointed out areas where she needed improvement, particularly in understanding the technical aspects of building maintenance and the complexities of tenant law. "You've surprised a lot of people," Susan concluded, "including me, but you're still just scratching the surface of what you need to know." "I want to learn more," Isabella insisted, "whatever it takes." Susan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because there's a situation developing that could be a valuable learning experience." She pulled out another file. The Riverside Commons project. Isabella knew about Riverside Commons. It was one of their older properties, a mixed-use development that her grandfather had built in the 1970s. The complex included residential apartments, small businesses, and a community center. "The board is pushing to sell it for redevelopment," Susan explained. "The numbers look good on paper. Luxury condos would bring in significantly more revenue than the current mix of rent-controlled apartments and small business leases." "But," Isabella prompted, sensing there was more to the story, "but the property is home to over 200 families, many of whom have lived there for decades. It also houses 30 small businesses that are vital to the neighborhood's character and economy." Isabella thought about the elderly couple she had met on her first day, about their stories of her grandfather's commitment to the community. What are our options? That's what you're going to figure out, Susan replied. I want you to do a complete analysis, not just the financial numbers, but the human equation too. Talk to the residents, understand their concerns, look at the impact on the neighborhood. Then present your findings to the property management team next month. It was a huge responsibility, and Isabella felt the weight of it. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about people's lives and livelihoods. That evening, she met Alex for dinner at a small Vietnamese restaurant near Riverside Commons. The place was family-owned, and the owner's daughter waited tables while studying for her college entrance exams. You seem preoccupied, Alex noted, as Isabella pushed her pho around with her chopsticks. She told him about the Riverside Commons situation, watching his expression carefully. What would you do? She asked finally. Professionally? The numbers probably support redevelopment, he admitted. But business isn't just about numbers anymore. Companies are being judged on their social impact, their community engagement. Sometimes the most profitable decision isn't the right one. My grandfather understood that, Isabella mused. He built communities, not just buildings. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. After dinner, they walked through the neighborhood around Riverside Commons. The streets were alive with activity, families returning from work, children playing in the small park, elderly residents sitting on stoops and chatting with neighbors. Small businesses were closing up for the day, their owners exchanging greetings in multiple languages. This is what real estate development should be about, Isabella said softly. Creating spaces where life happens, where communities grow. Alex squeezed her hand. Sounds like you already know what you want to do. Knowing is one thing, convincing the board is another. She stopped walking, turning to face him. Will you help me? Not as a representative of Clayton and Brooks, but as someone who understands both. The business and human sides of this. He smiled. You don't need my help anymore, Isabella. You've grown more in these past 3 months than most people do in years. But yes, I'll help you. As a friend and maybe... He hesitated, then continued. Maybe as something more, if you're ready for that. Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. But before she could respond, her phone rang. It was her father. Isabella, his voice was urgent. We need you at the office first thing tomorrow morning. There's been a development with Riverside Commons. Someone's making a move to force the sale, and they're not playing nice. The next morning, Isabella arrived at Morgan Tower earlier than usual, her mind racing with possibilities. The lobby, usually quiet at this hour, was already buzzing with activity. In the executive elevator, she ran into Theodore, who looked equally concerned. I came as soon as I heard, he said as they ascended. Your father called me last night. The conference room was filled with familiar faces. Her father, several board members, and the company's legal team. On the large screen at the end of the room was a presentation showing detailed plans for a luxury development where Riverside Commons currently stood. Sterling Development Group, her father announced without preamble. They've acquired enough surrounding properties to make a play for the entire block. They're offering well above market value for Riverside Commons, with the threat of legal action if we refuse. Isabella studied the renderings on the screen, gleaming glass towers that would dwarf the existing neighborhood, high-end retail spaces that would replace the family-owned businesses. How can they force a sale if we don't want to sell? The head of the legal team, James Patterson, cleared his throat. They're claiming that the current state of Riverside Commons constitutes urban blight, that redevelopment is in the public interest. They've already lined up support from several city council members. Blight? Isabella's voice rose in disbelief. I was just there yesterday. The buildings are older, yes, but they're well maintained. The community is thriving. The community isn't the point, one of the board members interjected. This offer represents a significant profit opportunity. Given our recent financial challenges, we'd be foolish not to consider it. Isabella felt her face flush with anger, but years of social training helped her maintain her composure. May I present another perspective? Her father nodded, and Isabella moved to the front of the room. Using her tablet, she quickly pulled Up photos she had taken during her visits to Riverside Commons, children playing in the community center, small businesses serving local residents, elderly neighbors tending the community garden. "This is what my grandfather built," she said, firmly. "Not just buildings, but a living, breathing community. Yes, the structures are aging, but they're home to hundreds of families who have built their lives there. They're the foundation for dozens of small businesses that provide jobs and services to the neighborhood." She switched to another set of images, architectural plans from the property management office. "We don't need to sell to Sterling. We can renovate and upgrade the existing structures, maintaining their character while improving their functionality. Yes, it would cost money, but it would also generate long-term value, both financial and social." The room was quiet as she continued, laying out a detailed plan for sustainable renovation that would preserve the community while gradually increasing property values. She had spent countless hours studying similar projects in other cities, learning from both successes and failures. "The world is changing," she concluded. "People are tired of seeing their neighborhoods erased by luxury developments that price out long-time residents. We have an opportunity here to show that the Morgan Real Estate Group is changing too, that we can be profitable while also being responsible community stewards." Theodore was the first to speak. "She's right. The future of real estate isn't just about maximizing short-term profits. It's about creating sustainable developments that benefit both investors and communities." "The numbers don't lie," another board member argued. "Sterling's offer would solve our financial problems overnight." "But at what cost?" Isabella challenged. "Our reputation, our integrity, the trust my grandfather built with these communities." Her father had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion. Now he stood commanding the room's attention. "I've made many mistakes in recent years," he said slowly, "chasing profits at the expense of principles. Perhaps it's time to remember what this company was built on." He turned to Isabella. "You have 1 month. Put together a comprehensive renovation plan for Riverside Commons. Show us exactly how we can make this work, financially and socially. If you can prove it's viable, you'll have my full support in fighting Sterling's takeover attempt." But the board members exchanged glances, but no one objected. Isabella felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but it wasn't crushing anymore. It was energizing. As the meeting dispersed, Theodore caught up with her in the hallway. "Sayatika, you're not alone in this," he said quietly. "You've grown into exactly the kind of leader this company needs. Your grandfather would be proud." Isabella smiled, thinking of all the changes the past few months had brought. "Thank you, Theodore, for everything, including not marrying me." He chuckled. "My dear, you were always meant for a different path. Now shall we start working on saving your grandfather's legacy?" The next few weeks became a blur of activity for Isabella as she threw herself into the Riverside Commons project. Her small apartment transformed into a makeshift command center, with walls covered in plans, photos, and community feedback notes. She spent her days meeting with residents, consulting with architects, and studying similar renovation projects around the country. One evening, as she was reviewing budget projections, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Maria Rodriguez, the owner of the small restaurant where she often grabbed lunch near Riverside Commons. "Miss Morgan," Maria said, clutching a Tupperware container. "I brought you some dinner. The other tenants and I noticed you haven't eaten properly these past few days." Isabella was touched by the gesture, suddenly realizing she hadn't eaten since morning. She invited Maria in, clearing space at her small dining table. "All these papers," Maria observed, looking around. "You're really fighting for us, aren't you?" "I'm trying," Isabella replied, gratefully accepting a plate of homemade enchiladas. "But Sterling Development isn't making it easy. They've launched a PR campaign painting the renovation as anti-progress." Maria's expression hardened. "Anti-progress? My restaurant has been feeding this community for 20 years. My children grew up here, went to college from here. The money we earn helps support our extended family. Is that not progress?" As they talked, Isabella learned more about the community's history. Maria shared stories about how her restaurant had started as a small cart, how Isabella's grandfather had encouraged her to take the leap into a permanent location, even helping with the initial lease terms. He understood that a neighborhood needs more than just buildings, Maria said. It needs heart, soul, history. Inspired by the conversation, Isabella spent the next day organizing a community meeting in the Riverside Commons central courtyard. The turnout was overwhelming. Not just current residents and business owners, but former residents, community leaders, and even local politicians who had grown up in the area. As she listened to their stories and concerns, an idea began to form. She pulled out her phone and called Alex. "I need your help with something," she said when he answered. "How much do you know about social impact bonds?" The next morning, Isabella walked into her father's office with a new proposal. She had spent the night refining it, fueled by coffee and determination. "Social impact investing," she announced, spreading out her documents. "We create a special investment vehicle that allows the community to become stakeholders in their own neighborhood's development." Her father looked skeptical. "The community can't possibly raise enough capital." "Not alone," Isabella interrupted, "but with corporate partners who understand the value of sustainable community development, plus government grants for historic preservation and green building initiatives." She laid out the numbers, showing how the financing could work. "It's innovative," her father admitted, studying the projections, "but risky. The board will need convincing." "Then let me convince them," Isabella said firmly. "But first, I want you to come with me to Riverside Commons. There's something you need to see." That afternoon, Isabella led her father through the neighborhood. She introduced him to residents who remembered his own father, showed him the community center, where local kids learned music and art, and finally brought him to Maria's restaurant. As they sat eating the best Mexican food Richard Morgan had ever tasted, Isabella watched her father's expression soften. She could see him remembering his own father's vision, understanding why these connections mattered. "You, Doe," he said finally, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. "Your grandfather used to say that real estate wasn't just about property values, it was about human values." "He was right," Isabella replied, "and that's what I'm trying to protect. Here, not just the buildings, but the values they represent." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the restaurant window, they could see a group of people gathering around a man in an expensive suit who was taking photos of the buildings. "Sterling Development," Isabella's father growled, recognizing one of their executives. "They're not waiting for our answer." Isabella was already on her feet. "Then it's time we gave them one." She pulled out her phone and dialed Theodore's number. "Remember how you said I wasn't alone in this? I need to call in that support now." As she stepped outside to face the Sterling executive, Isabella felt a strength she had never known before. This wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger than herself. And this time, she knew exactly what she was fighting for. The confrontation with Sterling Development's executive turned into an unexpected turning point. As Isabella approached him, residents began gathering around, forming a protective circle around their neighborhood. Local news cameras appeared, drawn by the growing crowd. "Mr. Phillips," Isabella addressed the Sterling executive. Recognizing him from their previous encounters, "I believe you're trespassing on private property." James Phillips smiled condescendingly. "Just documenting the obvious need for urban renewal, Miss Morgan. Surely you can see that this area is underutilized." "Underutilized?" A new voice joined the conversation. Theodore Westminster stepped out of his car, followed by Alex and a team of people Isabella didn't recognize. "I believe you're looking at one of the most efficiently utilized urban communities in the city." The crowd murmured as Theodore introduced his companions, experts in urban planning, community development, and sustainable architecture. They had been working with Isabella behind the scenes, helping her develop her renovation proposal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Theodore announced, addressing the news cameras directly, "you're witnessing something remarkable today. Not just a community defending its home, but a new vision for urban development." Isabella stepped forward, feeling the strength of the community behind her. Sterling Development sees this neighborhood as nothing more than potential luxury condos, but we see it differently. We see families who have built lives here, businesses that serve their community, and a model of sustainable urban living that cities across the country are trying to recreate. She gestured to the buildings around them. These structures don't need to be demolished. They need to be celebrated and renewed. That's why the Morgan Real Estate Group is announcing a new initiative today. Her father moved to stand beside her, nodding his encouragement. They had discussed this moment earlier, and he had finally understood what she was trying to achieve. The Riverside Commons Community Trust, Isabella continued, will be a partnership between the Morgan Real Estate Group, local residents, and social impact investors. Together we'll renovate these buildings while preserving their character and affordability. But more importantly, we'll create a new model of community-oriented development that proves profit and social responsibility can coexist. Alex stepped forward with presentation boards showing the renovation plans. The designs maintained the historical character of the buildings while incorporating modern sustainability features. Solar panels would reduce energy costs, green spaces would be expanded, and local businesses would get improved facilities. "This is a joke," Philip scoffed. "The board will never approve such a sentimental project." "Actually," Theodore interjected, "as a major shareholder and board member, I'm fully supporting this initiative, and I'm not alone." He nodded to several other figures emerging from cars, more board members who had come to witness the announcement. The news cameras captured everything: the community's solidarity, Sterling Development's discomfort, and most importantly, the Morgan family standing united with their tenants. It was a powerful image that would dominate business news for days to come. Later that evening, as the excitement died down, Isabella found herself sitting with Alex in the Riverside Commons courtyard. The space was quiet now, but she could still feel the energy of the day's events. "You did it," Alex said softly. "You found a way to honor both your grandfather's legacy and your own vision." Isabella looked around at the neighborhood she had grown to love. "We did it," she corrected him. "I couldn't have done this alone." Speaking of not being alone, Alex turned to face her fully. "Remember that conversation we almost had, before all this started, about being something more than friends?" Isabella felt her heart flutter. "I remember." "Think I fell in love with you," he said simply. "Not the socialite I first met, but the woman you've become. The leader who fights for what she believes in, who sees value in community, who isn't afraid to stand up against the odds." Before Isabella could respond, they were interrupted by Maria, bringing them cups of coffee. The older woman smiled knowingly at their obvious moment and began to walk away, but Isabella called her back. "Stay," she said. "Both of you represent what I've learned these past months. That success isn't about what you own, but what you build together. That love isn't just about romance, but about community and purpose." She took Alex's hand, accepting both his declaration and the future it represented. "And I think I'm finally ready for all of it." The weeks following the Riverside Commons announcement brought changes that rippled through both the Morgan Real Estate Group and the broader business community. The story had captured the public's imagination: a wealthy heiress choosing to live in a modest apartment, working from the ground up, and fighting to preserve a community rather than maximize profits. Isabella sat in her office at the property management division, now decorated with thank you cards from Riverside Commons residents and news clippings about the project. Susan Martinez entered carrying a thick folder. "The first round of renovation permits just came through," Susan announced, dropping the folder on Isabella's desk. "And you've got reporters from the Wall Street Journal waiting in the lobby. They want to do a feature on the new face of real estate development." Isabella smiled, remembering how different her life had been just months ago when she appeared in those same papers for very different reasons. "Tell them I'll meet them at Riverside Commons. They should see what they're writing about firsthand." As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Board meeting in an hour. Bring your community trust proposal. They're ready to listen." The Morgan Real Estate Group's boardroom felt different now. Where once she had seen only stern faces and power suits, Isabella now recognized allies in the transformation of their company. Even Janet Chen, once her harshest critic, had become a supporter of the new direction. "The numbers from the Riverside Commons announcement are impressive," Janet began, pulling up a presentation. "Our stock price has actually increased since we announced the renovation plan. It seems the market responds well to socially responsible development." Isabella presented her expanded proposal for the Community Trust Initiative. "What we've created at Riverside Commons can be a model for other properties. Not every development needs to be luxury condos. There's profit to be made in preserving and enhancing existing communities." She showed projections for similar projects in other neighborhoods, each one combining renovation with community involvement and sustainable practices. The board members leaned forward, engaged and curious rather than skeptical. "There's something else," her father added, standing to join her at the front of the room. "Theodore Westminster and his firm have proposed a joint venture specifically focused on community-oriented development projects." Theodore, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "What Isabella has shown us is that the future of real estate isn't just about building new towers, it's about building stronger communities. My firm wants to be part of that future." After the meeting, Isabella found Alex waiting for her in the lobby. He had become a regular fixture at Morgan Tower, his expertise in modern finance complementing her growing understanding of community development. "How did it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the elevator. "Better than I could have imagined," she replied. "The board isn't just accepting the changes, they're embracing them. We're going to expand the community trust model to other properties." They stepped into the elevator, and Alex pressed the button for the ground floor. "Speaking of changes," he said, "I have something to show you." He led her to a nearby coffee shop, not one of the fancy establishments she used to frequent, but a cozy local place with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh-baked pastries. "Remember our first real conversation?" he asked as they sat down. "When you were still the rebellious heiress and I was pretending to be just a financial analyst." Isabella laughed. "How could I forget? You told me about your grandmother's arranged marriage and said the hardest prison to escape is the one built with golden bars." "Well, I've been thinking about that conversation a lot lately," Alex continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "About how sometimes the best things in life come from breaking free of expectations and finding your own path." He pulled out a small, simple ring. Not the kind of enormous diamond she would have expected in her old life, but something more meaningful, a vintage piece with a story behind it. "This was my grandmother's," he explained. "After she escaped that arranged marriage, she met my grandfather, a simple teacher who loved her for who she was, not what she represented. They built a life together based on love and shared values." Isabella's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Alex continued, his voice soft but sure. "I'm not asking you to marry me because of business advantages or family alliances. I'm asking because watching you transform from that angry, trapped woman into this incredible force for change has made me fall more in love with you every day." He held out the ring. "Isabella Morgan, will you build something real with me? Not just buildings or businesses, but a life that matters?" Isabella looked at the ring in Alex's hand, so different from the massive diamond that would have sealed her fate with Theodore months ago. This simple band held real history, real meaning, just like everything else in her new life. "Yes," she said softly, then louder, with more certainty. "Yes, I will build something real with you." As Alex slipped the ring onto her finger, a familiar voice spoke from nearby. "I believe this calls for a celebration." They looked up to see Theodore standing there, his eyes twinkling. Behind him were Isabella's parents, Susan Martinez, and several residents from Riverside Commons, including Maria with her famous enchiladas. "You planned this?" Isabella asked Alex, laughing through happy tears. "We all did," her father replied, stepping forward to embrace her. "Because we all wanted to be part of this moment. The moment you chose love and purpose over obligation and expectation." The small coffee shop became the scene of an impromptu engagement party, with community members and corporate executives mingling naturally. Isabella watched as her mother, still elegant in designer clothes, chatted animatedly with Maria about recipes. Her father and Theodore discussed plans for the community development initiative with some of the local business owners. "You've changed all of us," Alex said quietly, watching the scene. "Not just yourself," Isabella squeezed his hand. "We changed together, all of us." Later that evening, Isabella stood in her small apartment, the one she had once seen as a symbol of her rebellion, but now recognized as the place where she had truly found herself. She was packing some things, preparing to move in with Alex, but she had decided to keep the apartment. "I want to rent it to someone who needs a fresh start," she explained to her father, who had come to help her pack. "Maybe another young person trying to find their way." Richard Morgan looked around the modest space that had transformed his daughter from a privileged socialite into a confident leader. "Your grandfather would have loved that idea," he said. "He always said that real estate wasn't just about properties, it was about possibilities." "I understand that now," Isabella replied, "just like I understand why you wanted to protect me all those years. But sometimes protection can become a prison." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "And sometimes what looks like rebellion can actually be wisdom." He picked up a framed photo of the Riverside Commons community celebration. "You've taught me as much as I ever taught you." A knock at the door revealed Theodore, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing a broad smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I thought we might need this." He held up an old photograph, one showing Isabella's grandfather standing in front of Riverside Commons on its opening day. "I found this in my archives," he explained. "Thought you might want it for your new office, the executive one you'll be moving into next month." Isabella looked at him in surprise. "Executive office?" Her father smiled. "The board voted this afternoon. You're being promoted to director of community development, a new position created specifically for the initiatives you've championed. On one condition," Theodore added with a twinkle in his eye. "You have to promise to keep your connection to the community. No moving back to a penthouse just because you can afford it now." Isabella laughed, looking around at her small apartment, at the ring on her finger, at the people who had helped her find her true path. "No chance of that," she assured them. "I've learned that real luxury isn't about what you have. It's about what you build, what you preserve, and who you become in the process." She raised her glass in a toast to new beginnings built on strong foundations. As they clinked glasses, Isabella caught her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her wasn't the rebellious socialite who had once fought against an arranged marriage, nor was she simply the daughter of a real estate mogul. She was something entirely new, a leader who had found her own way, a woman who had learned to balance progress with preservation, and someone who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or sold. Outside, the lights of Riverside Commons twinkled in the distance, a reminder of battles won and lessons learned. But more importantly, they were a beacon of hope for the future, a future she would build not just with Alex, but with her entire extended family of colleagues, community members, and friends who had become something more than just business, their associates. The engagement announcement in the Wall Street Journal couldn't have been more different from what would have been published just months ago. Instead of focusing on the merging of wealthy families or speculating about prenuptial agreements, the article highlighted Isabella and Alex's shared vision for community-oriented development and their commitment to sustainable business practices. Isabella sat in her new office at Morgan Tower, the old photo of her grandfather now hanging prominently on the wall as she reviewed plans for their upcoming wedding. Unlike the extravagant society event she had once envisioned for herself, this celebration would reflect who they had become. "The community center at Riverside Commons," her mother asked incredulously when Isabella shared the venue choice. "But, darling, we could have the Metropolitan Museum of Art or that lovely garden at the—" "Mom," Isabella interrupted gently, "this is exactly where we want to celebrate. These are our people now." Margaret Morgan studied her daughter's face, seeing the certainty there. "You really have changed," she said softly, "and perhaps it's time I did too." She pulled out her tablet, revealing research she'd done on community center renovation projects. "If we're going to have a wedding there, maybe we could help make Some improvements that would benefit everyone. Isabella hugged her mother, touched by this unexpected gesture of support. Together, they began planning not just a wedding, but a celebration that would leave a lasting positive impact on the community. The next few weeks were filled with a different kind of wedding preparation than Isabella had ever imagined. Instead of choosing between luxury caterers, she worked with local restaurants, including Maria's, to create a menu that celebrated the neighborhood's diverse culinary traditions. Rather than importing exotic flowers, they partnered with the community garden to provide centerpieces that would later be replanted. One afternoon, as she was discussing the plans with Alex in the community center, Theodore stopped by. "I hope I'm still invited," he said with a warm smile, "even though I'm not the groom." Isabella laughed, embracing him. "You're one of our honored guests. None of this would have happened without you." "Actually," Theodore said, "I came to discuss something else." He pulled out a folder containing proposals for expanding the Community Trust Initiative to other cities. "Your vision has caught the attention of developers nationwide. They want to learn from what we're doing here." Alex looked through the documents with interest. This could be huge, a whole network of community-oriented development projects, sharing resources and best practices. "Exactly," Theodore nodded. "And we think you two should lead it, together." The proposal was ambitious, creating a new division within the Morgan Real Estate Group focused entirely on community development and sustainable urban renewal. It would mean traveling to other cities, working with different communities, and helping other developers understand the value of preserving neighborhood character while promoting responsible growth. "It's a big step," Theodore acknowledged. "But you've proven that this model works. Now it's time to share it with the world." As they discussed the possibilities, Isabella's father arrived, carrying another surprise. "I found these in the company archives," he said, spreading out old photographs and documents on the table. They showed community celebrations, groundbreaking ceremonies, and ribbon cuttings from the early days of Morgan Real Estate. "Your grandfather kept everything," Richard explained. "Every thank you note from residents, every newspaper clipping about community improvements. He believed that real estate development should bring people together, not drive them apart." Looking at the old photos, Isabella saw parallels between those early community gatherings and their upcoming wedding celebration. "We're not just planning a wedding," she realized. "We're continuing a legacy." That evening, she and Alex walked through Riverside Commons, greeting residents who had become friends. Children played in the newly renovated playground, seniors chatted on benches in the community garden, and local businesses buzzed with activity. "You know," Alex said, "when I first met you, I never imagined we'd end up here." "In Riverside Commons?" "No," he smiled, "building something that matters, something real." Isabella looked around at the neighborhood that had taught her so much about value, community, and purpose. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We have so much more to build together." As if to emphasize her point, a group of residents approached them with wedding decoration ideas, each suggestion reflecting the character and spirit of the community they had all worked to preserve. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the autumn sun casting a golden glow over Riverside Commons. The community center had been transformed, but not in the way of typical society weddings. Instead of crystal chandeliers and imported flowers, the space was decorated with handcrafted items from local artisans, photographs of the neighborhood's history, and flowers from the community garden. Isabella stood in what had once been her grandfather's office, now converted into a bridal preparation room. Her wedding dress was elegant but simple, chosen from a local designer who had started her business in one of the Riverside Commons shops. Around her, a mix of worlds collaborated on final preparations, her mother adjusting her veil while Maria added the final touches to her bouquet. "Something old," her mother said, fastening a delicate necklace that had belonged to Isabella's grandmother. "She would have loved seeing you today." "Something new," Maria added, tucking a fresh sprig of herbs from the community garden into the bouquet. "For good luck and sweet memories." A knock at the door revealed Susan Martinez, who had become not just a mentor, but a friend. "The guests are arriving," she announced, "and wait until you see who's here." The guest list was unlike any society, wedding the city had seen. Residents of Riverside Commons sat alongside business executives. Children from the community center's after-school program served as flower attendants. Local musicians provided the soundtrack, their music a celebration of the neighborhood's diverse cultural heritage. Theodore stood at the entrance, greeting guests with the air of a proud uncle rather than a former almost fiancé. When Isabella's father came to escort her down the aisle, his eyes glistened with tears. "You know," Richard said quietly as they waited for their cue, "I spent years trying to control your future, thinking I knew what was best, but you found something I never could have given you, a purpose bigger than yourself." The ceremony itself was a beautiful blend of traditions and innovations. Instead of traditional wedding vows, Isabella and Alex shared promises not just to each other, but to the community they had come to serve. They pledged to continue building bridges between different worlds, to remember that true value isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched and communities strengthened. "I promise," Alex said, his voice carrying through the packed community center, "to build with you not just a life but a legacy of positive change." "And I promise," Isabella responded, "to never forget the lessons that brought us here, that love, like community, grows stronger when we nurture it together." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Isabella had experienced in her former life of luxury galas. Children played among the guests, local restaurants served their signature dishes, and stories were shared in multiple languages. The community center buzzed with genuine joy and connection. During the reception, Theodore clinked his glass for attention. "I'd like to share something," he said, pulling out an old letter. This was written by Richard Morgan Sr., Isabella's grandfather, when he first opened Riverside Commons. He read, "Real estate is not just about building structures, it's about creating spaces where lives can flourish, where communities can grow, where people from all walks of life can find their place. Success should be measured not in profit margins alone, but in the smiles of children playing, in the pride of small business owners opening their shops, in the conversations between neighbors who might never have met otherwise." Isabella felt tears in her eyes as Theodore continued, "Today we're not just celebrating a wedding, we're celebrating the continuation of that vision carried forward by a new generation who understands that the greatest investments we can make are in each other." As the evening drew to a close, Isabella and Alex stood in the community garden, now lit with strings of warm lights. Around them, their guests continued to celebrate, business partners discussing community projects with local residents, children teaching their parents dances they'd learned in the community center, families sharing stories and dreams. "Look at what we built," Alex said softly, gesturing to the scene before them. "No," Isabella corrected him with a smile. "Look at what we're still building." She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a rebellious socialite facing an arranged marriage to a woman who had found her true calling. The golden cage she had once fought so hard to escape had transformed into something else entirely, a foundation for building real change in the world. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the community they had come to love, Isabella knew that this was just the beginning of their story. Together, they would continue to build bridges between worlds, to prove that success and social responsibility could go hand in hand, and to show that the most valuable things in life are the connections we create and the communities we nurture. 6. Months after the wedding, Isabella and Alex found themselves presenting their community development model at a national urban planning conference in Chicago. The Riverside Commons success story had caught the attention of developers and city planners across the country, all eager to learn how they had managed to balance preservation with progress. The conference hall was packed as Isabella took the stage. Looking out at the audience, she saw faces from every corner of the real estate and urban development world. Some were skeptical, others curious, but all were interested in what the Morgan Real Estate Group had achieved. "When we started this journey," Isabella began, "many people told us it couldn't be done. that profit and community preservation were mutually exclusive. That development had to mean displacement. She clicked to a slide showing before and after pictures of Riverside Commons. We proved them wrong. Alex joined her on stage, adding the financial perspective to their presentation. The numbers tell an interesting story, he explained, displaying charts that showed not just monetary returns, but also metrics for community well-being, local business growth, and resident retention. During the Q&A session, a developer from Seattle raised his hand. This all sounds wonderful in theory, but not every community has a wealthy real estate company willing to prioritize social impact over profit margins. How can this model work elsewhere? Isabella smiled. That's exactly why we're here today. The community trust model we developed isn't just for wealthy companies. It's a framework that can be adapted to any community, any scale. She revealed their next announcement, the creation of a national network of community development trusts, with Riverside Commons serving as the pilot program. After the presentation, they were approached by Sarah Chen, a young developer from San Francisco. My family has owned properties in Chinatown for generations, she explained. We're facing pressure from luxury developers, but we want to preserve the community's character. Could your model work there? This conversation led to an impromptu working dinner where Isabella, Alex, and Sarah sketched out possibilities on napkins and tablet screens. They were soon joined by other conference attendees, a historic preservation expert from Boston, a community organizer from New Orleans, a sustainable architecture professor from Portland. Back in their hotel room that night, Isabella called her father to share the day's developments. Dad, I think this is bigger than we imagined. These communities across the country, they're all facing the same challenges we did with Riverside Commons. Then maybe it's time to think even bigger, Richard Morgan replied. Your grandfather always said that true innovation in real estate comes from seeing possibilities others miss. The next morning, Isabella and Alex met with Theodore, who had flown in to join them. Over breakfast, they outlined an ambitious plan, a national initiative to create a network of community development trusts, each adapted to its local context, but sharing resources, expertise, and support. It's not just about preserving buildings, Isabella explained, spreading out their notes. It's about creating a new model of urban development that others can follow. Theodore studied their proposal thoughtfully. You know what this reminds me of? Your grandfather's original vision for Morgan Real Estate. He didn't just want to build buildings, he wanted to build a better way of doing business. As they refined their plans, news arrived from New York. Sterling Development had announced they were revising their approach to urban development, citing the success of the Riverside Commons model. The company that had once threatened to destroy a community was now asking to learn from it. That evening, Isabella stood at the window of their hotel room, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city before her was a tapestry of old and new, of preservation and progress, of communities fighting to maintain their identity in the face of change. What are you thinking about? Alex asked, joining her at the window. About how sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, she replied. A year ago, I was fighting against an arranged marriage, thinking that was the biggest battle of my life. Now look at where we are. Alex wrapped his arms around her. And where exactly is that? On the verge of something important, she said confidently. Something that could change not just one community, but communities across the country. The expansion of the Community Development Trust Initiative moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Within weeks of the Chicago conference, Isabella and Alex found themselves traveling across the country, meeting with community leaders, local developers, and city officials who were interested in implementing their model. Their first stop was San Francisco's Chinatown, where they worked with Sarah Chen to adapt the Riverside Commons framework to the unique challenges of her community. The lessons they learned there about cultural preservation, multi-generational business succession, and the importance of language accessibility in community engagement became valuable additions to their growing toolkit. Back in New York, the Riverside Commons community continued to thrive. Maria's restaurant had expanded, now offering cooking classes in the renovated community center. The small businesses were flourishing, and a new mentorship program paired established business owners with young entrepreneurs from the neighborhood. One morning, as Isabella prepared for a video conference with potential partners in Boston, she received an unexpected visit from Janet Chen, the board member who had once been her harshest critic. "I owe you an apology," Janet said, settling into a chair in Isabella's office. "When you first proposed this community-oriented approach, I thought it was naive idealism. But you've proven that doing good can also be good business." Isabella smiled, remembering their early confrontations. "I was naive in many ways," she admitted. "But sometimes it takes a fresh perspective to see possibilities that experience might miss." Their conversation was interrupted by Alex arriving with exciting news. "The Newark project just got approved," he announced. "The community council voted unanimously to adopt our model for their downtown renovation." The Newark project was particularly meaningful because it involved rehabilitating a historically significant neighborhood that had faced decades of neglect. Working with local leaders, they had developed a plan that would preserve the area's rich cultural heritage while creating opportunities for economic growth. That evening, Isabella and Alex hosted a dinner at their apartment, not the penthouse she once occupied, but a comfortable home in a diverse neighborhood they had grown to love. Their guests included Theodore, her parents, Susan Martinez, and community leaders from various projects they were developing. As they shared meals and stories, Isabella looked around the table, marveling at how her world had expanded. Here was her mother, earnestly discussing community gardening initiatives with an urban farming expert. Her father, who once measured success solely in profit margins, was deep in conversation with a social impact investor about sustainable development. "Metrics. You know what this reminds me of?" Theodore said, observing the scene. "Your wedding reception. Different worlds coming together, learning from each other." After dinner, as they cleared the dishes together, Alex turned to Isabella. "I have something to tell you," he said, his eyes twinkling. "The community development network we proposed. The Gates Foundation wants to help scale it nationally." Isabella nearly dropped the plate she was holding. "Are you serious?" "They see what we've built as a potential model for sustainable urban development across the country. They want to help create a foundation that would provide resources and support for communities looking to implement our approach." The news was overwhelming in the best possible way. It meant their vision could reach even further, help more communities, create more positive change. Later that night, after their guests had left, Isabella stood on their small balcony, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a reluctant bride-to-be in an arranged marriage to a leader in community-oriented development. Alex joined her, wrapping a warm jacket around her shoulders. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about how life surprises you," she replied. "A year ago, I thought I was fighting against a future that was being forced on me. Instead, I was being guided toward a future I could never have imagined." "Speaking of the future," Alex said softly, "there's something else we should talk about." He placed his hand gently on her stomach. "How do you feel about building our family while we're building communities?" Isabella's eyes widened as she understood his meaning. Their journey was about to take another unexpected turn, but this time, she was ready for whatever came next. After all, the best foundations are built with love, understanding, and a commitment to something bigger than oneself. 1 year later, Isabella stood in her grandfather's restored office at Riverside Commons, now serving as the headquarters for the National Community Development Network. Her hand rested gently on her growing belly as she reviewed the latest reports from their projects across the country. The walls were covered with photographs, success stories from various communities where their model had taken root. San Francisco's Chinatown had successfully preserved its cultural heritage while modernizing its infrastructure. A historic African-American neighborhood in Chicago had been revitalized without displacing longtime residents. A Puerto Rican community in Boston had transformed abandoned buildings into thriving cultural centers. "Ready for the board meeting?" Alex asked, entering the office with a stack of presentations. The quarterly meeting would be different this time. Representatives from their partner communities across the country would be joining virtually to share their experiences and progress. Before Isabella could respond, she heard familiar voices in the hallway. Theodore entered first, followed by her parents and, to her surprise, James Phillips from Sterling Development, the same executive who had once tried to force the sale of Riverside Commons. "I hope you don't mind an early arrival," Phillips said, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I wanted to speak with you before the meeting." Isabella gestured for everyone to sit, curious about what the man who had once been their opponent had to say. "I've been visiting your project sites," Phillips began, "watching how your model works in different communities. It's humbling to admit, but you've changed the way we think about development at Sterling." He pulled out a proposal document. "We'd like to join your network, not as competitors or developers, but as students. We want to learn how to do this right." Isabella exchanged glances with Alex and Theodore. This was exactly the kind of change they had hoped to inspire, transforming the industry from within, one company at a time. "There's something else," Richard Morgan added, standing to address his daughter. "The board has made a decision. We want to rename the company." Isabella looked puzzled. The Morgan Real Estate Group had been the company's name for 3 generations. "From now on," her father continued, "we'll be known as Morgan Community Development Group. Because that's what your grandfather always intended us to be, builders of communities, not just buildings." The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This wasn't just a name change. It was an acknowledgement that the vision Isabella had fought for had become the company's new foundation. As they prepared for the board meeting, Isabella took a moment to visit Maria's restaurant downstairs. The place was buzzing with lunchtime activity, and a new addition had been built, a teaching kitchen where Maria offered culinary training to young people from the community. "Ah, look who's glowing," Maria exclaimed, rushing to greet her. "How's the little one?" "Active," Isabella laughed, placing Maria's hand on her belly to feel the baby kick. "Just like this community, always full of energy and surprises." Maria's eyes twinkled. "You know, when you first came here, fighting against that arranged marriage, I never imagined you'd end up being the one who saved our neighborhood. Life has a funny way of leading us where we need to go." Back in the meeting room as board, members and community representatives gathered both in person and on screens. Isabella looked around at the faces that had become her extended family. Susan Martinez, who had taught her the importance of understanding the day-to-day realities of property management. Theodore, whose wisdom had guided her even when she was trying to push him away. Her father, who had learned to see success through a different lens. Alex squeezed her hand under the table as she stood to begin the meeting. "Before we start," she said, "I want to share something personal." She touched her belly gently. "In a few months, we'll be welcoming a new member to our family. And just as this baby represents our future, today's meeting represents the future we're building together. A future where development doesn't mean displacement, where progress doesn't erase history, and where communities grow stronger together." The room erupted in applause, but Isabella wasn't finished. "My grandfather used to say that real estate was about creating spaces where lives could flourish. Today, we're not just managing properties or renovating buildings. We're nurturing communities, preserving histories, and building bridges between different worlds." 5 years had passed since Isabella first walked into the property management office at Riverside Commons. Now, on a bright spring morning, she stood in the community garden, watching her 4-year-old daughter Sophia help Maria plant tomatoes, while Alex chased their 1-year-old son Richard around the flower beds. The garden had become a symbol of everything they'd achieved, a place where different generations and cultures came together, where growth was carefully nurtured, and where the fruits of their labor were shared by all. The Morgan Community Development Group had expanded its model to over 50 cities across the country, each project unique, but built on the same foundation of community engagement and sustainable development. "Mama, look!" Sophia called out proudly, holding up a seedling. "Maria says if we take care of it, it will grow big and strong." Isabella smiled, remembering her own growth over the years. The arranged marriage that had once seemed like a prison sentence had instead become the catalyst, for finding her true purpose. Theodore, now semi-retired but still an active advisor to their community network, often joked that his greatest contribution to the company was not marrying her. The sound of familiar footsteps made her turn. Her father approached, carrying a stack of papers, and wearing the relaxed expression that had become more common since he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations. "The final papers for the Boston project just came through," he announced. "The community trust model has been approved unanimously, but that's not why I'm here." He handed Isabella an old leather-bound journal. "I found this in your grandfather's things. I think it's time you had it." Isabella opened the journal carefully, recognizing her grandfather's handwriting. It was his personal diary from the early days of the company, filled with his thoughts, dreams, and vision for what real estate development could be. One entry caught her eye. "Today I watched children playing in the courtyard of our first building. Their laughter reminded me that we're not just constructing walls and windows. We're creating spaces where lives unfold, where memories are made, where communities take root. Success isn't measured in dollars, but in the smiles of those children, in the pride of local shopkeepers, in the conversations between neighbors who might never have met otherwise. That's the real foundation we're building." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes as she read words that could have been written about their work today. "He knew," she whispered. "He understood exactly what we're trying to do." "He would be so proud of you," her father said softly. "Not just of what you've built, but of who you've become." The moment was interrupted by small footsteps as Sophia ran up to them, her hands dirty from gardening. "Grandpa, Maria says you used to know her when she first started her restaurant. Tell me the story." Richard Morgan lifted his granddaughter, not minding the soil that got on his casual clothes, another change from the impeccably dressed businessman he'd once been. "Well, it all started with your great-grandfather, who believed that a neighborhood needs more than just buildings to thrive." Isabella watched them head toward the garden benches, where a small crowd of community members began to gather, drawn by the promise of another story about their neighborhood's history. Alex joined her, their young son now sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Something on your mind?" he asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just thinking about how life surprises you," she replied. "How fighting against what you think is wrong can lead you to what's absolutely right. How an arranged marriage I never wanted led me to a love story I never expected. Not just with you, but with this community, this purpose." Alex smiled, understanding perfectly. "And now we get to write the next chapter together." In the garden. Around them, the community they'd helped preserve continued to thrive. New saplings grew alongside mature trees, just as new businesses opened beside long-established ones. Children played while their parents and grandparents shared stories and traditions. The buildings stood strong, not as monuments to wealth or power, but as homes to the diverse tapestry of lives that made up their community. Isabella took her husband's free hand, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun and the promise of tomorrow. "You know what? This isn't just the next chapter," she said. "It's the beginning of a whole new story.